In the year 1893, the dust roads of Arkansas watched a lawman ride west. His name was Marshall Will. For 20 years, he had carried a badge through hard towns, darker nights, and places where justice had to stand taller than fear. But now, a new call was waiting beyond the red horizon. In the Arizona Territory, his family member, W.B. Calhoun, held 25,000 acres of wild desert land. Canyons split the earth like old scars. Winds moved through empty streets like whispers. And somewhere beneath that land, hidden from greed and gunfire, rested a sacred secret: the Holy Grail. Marshall Will came to Arizona to join the Arizona Marshals, but he soon learned this territory had its own kind of trouble. Outlaws rode faster. Rustlers struck at night. Horse thieves vanished into the hills. Claim jumpers dug where they had no right. Every sunrise brought a new test. Marshall was not a tall man, but no one measured him by height. He was a short black man with a steady stare, a yellow shirt, a red bandana around his neck, and a hand so fast on his gun that trouble often changed its mind. He believed justice was not something you talked about. It was something you protected. Then, one evening, while riding the edge of W.B. Calhoun's land, Marshall heard a sound coming from a cave. Not a beast, not a man, a calling. He stepped into the darkness, one careful boot at a time. At the back of the cave, a golden light pulsed against the stone. At first, Marshall thought he had found the Holy Grail itself, but beside the glow was something stranger: a golden rock. The moment he lifted it, the cave shook. Light ran through his hands. His fingers trembled. His whole body began to glow. Then his gun turned gold in its holster, shining like it had been forged by the sun. And from the walls came the voices of the ancestors who had protected that land long before him. Protect the Holy Grail at all costs. Marshall Will understood then. The golden rock had given him their power, but also their burden. He swore an oath in that cave. He would guard the Grail with his last breath. He would face every outlaw, rustler, thief, and shadow that crossed the desert. Then he spoke the words that would become his legend. When there's will, there's a way. Marshall Will walked out of that cave changed forever. No longer just a marshal, a man of justice, a guardian of the desert, the protector of the Holy Grail. In Stewarttown, inside Fraser Saloon, whispers drifted from table to table like desert dust. Every man had a theory about the Holy Ground. Some said it was buried deep in the Twin Mountains. Some claimed it hid in a canyon on the dark side of the range. Others swore it lay farther off, near the Grand Canyon, somewhere inside W.B. Calhoun's 25,000 acres. But nobody spoke too loud, because that land had a protector. His name was Marshall Will. He was a short black lawman in a yellow shirt, a red bandana, and a tan hat pulled low. Strangers sometimes smirked when they saw him, noticing his size before his courage. But the people of the Arizona Territory knew better. Marshall Will was fast with a gun, loyal to the law, and respected across W.B. Calhoun's land. Folks said he had more than 80 kills as a lawman. Others said his revolver was not the only thing that made him dangerous. They said something supernatural walked with him. That night, when Marshall Will entered Fraser Saloon, the music stopped. Glasses froze. Card players looked up. Two rowdy men rose from the back, full of whiskey courage and greedy questions. They demanded the secret of the Holy Grail and the location of the Holy Ground. Marshall Will looked at them, then laughed. He knew some secrets were not meant for men with hungry hands. The two men grew angry. In front of the whole saloon, they warned him that if he would not speak, they would draw. But Marshall Will did not move first. He waited. Then their hands twitched. In the blink of an eye, Marshall Will drew. Bang! Boom! Bang! Bang! Smoke rolled from his gun and filled the room. But when it cleared, Stewarttown had seen something it would never forget. For one shining second, Marshall Will's revolver lit up like gold. The bullets moved faster than fast. The two men fell before their fingers finished reaching. Marshall Will cried out, "Call the doctor! Call the doctor!" But the doctor was out of town. The townspeople carried the men to the back of the saloon, and slowly they disappeared from every story, except the one Stuarttown would always remember. After that night, no one dared speak of the Holy Grail in front of Marshal Will again. That was the origin of the Peacemaker. Not just a gun, not just a lawman, a warning. W.B. Calhoun gave Marshal Will 250 acres west of Struthers Creek and across the Twin Mountains. Marshal Will, a black man, short and built a little husky, a fast draw, a quick trigger finger, a man who upholds the law, of protector of the Holy Grail, at champion at law enforcement. Lady Taurus, beautiful in nature, her copper-toned skin shined in the light like a new coin, her double-barrel shotgun ready and waiting for an outlaw. Her .38 fastest, lightning quickest. Light can knock a man down in a half a breath, ready to protect the Holy Grail. And one of the peacemakers on W.B. Calhoun's land, but now she has strong feelings, falling in love with Marshal. Will let the romance begin. Marshal Will and Lady Taurus, and title Love is in the Air. As a romance has begun between the two characters, they quickly realized that they had a lot in common. Law enforcement being the peacemaker on WB, Calhoun's land being the sacred protectors of the Holy Grail, that's a lot of responsibility. One day, while they were having a picnic down by the waterfall at Struthers Creek, they heard a loud noise and a big boom, and smoke rose past the Twin Mountains. So they quickly settled up their horses and rode out to see what that noise was. And quickly they realized that W.B. Calhoun's property was being invaded by some big-money ranchers and some miners ready to come by W.B. Calhoun's mine for gold and treasures. Quickly, they jumped in the action. First, they observed what they were doing, where they were going, and exactly where their camp was at. Just as they started to get dark, it was time for them to make their move. They jumped down on these 22 men quicker than greased lightning. They had no idea what they were in for, as Marshal Will pulled out his golden gun and fired and fired and fired. To a group with a man fell down, as Lady Taurus pulled out her magical shotgun and let off 2 blasts that sound like 2 pieces of dynamite. As ever over several men fell, as she reloaded and fired again into the mind. With the rest of the 20 men resided scared and confused, not knowing what was going on, she fired into the mind. The mind blew up, dropping the miners inside as they screamed help. Things got silent. The wind blew with a mist of outlaws in the air, as Marshal Will rounded up the men outside of the mine and tied them up to a tree. Lady Taurus started moving a rock away from the mine, where the rest of the miners were trapped. He freed all the miners, as they came out dusty and dirty, coughing up the dust that were in the mine. At gunpoint, she landed them all up, and then she tied each one of them behind their back and made them lay face down on the ground. That's the tallest people showed up, and disbelief of what had happened. They helped Marshal Will take all the outlaws and the miners back to Stuarttown's jail. And together, Marshal Will and Lady Taurus has protected W.B. Calhoun's lands and Struthers Creek and the Holy Grail. One beautiful day on W.B. Calhoun's property, Marshal Will and Lady Taurus rode just past Struthers Creek, where flowers bloomed and a cool desert wind moved soft across the valley. Sunlight touched Lady Taurus, and her whole body began to glow. Beside her, Marshal Will felt the same supernatural fire rise through him. His golden gun pulsed at his hip. Her dark feathered hat shimmered, changed color, and a golden feather appeared like magic. That was no ordinary sign. Smoke curled beyond the canyon. Marshal Will narrowed his eyes. Lady Taurus leaned forward in her saddle. They rode toward the smoke, and down in the valley, trouble waited. The Wild Bunch from Rio Vista Hills had crossed onto W.B. Calhoun's land. They were long-bearded, wild-eyed, crazy-looking men, pale from dust and greed, thirsty for money and hungry for anything they could steal. They cracked whips at the frightened cattle, driving W.B. Calhoun's 500 head toward the canyon pass. The animals bawled and scattered, but the rustlers only laughed harder. Marshal Will's fingers started twitching. Lady Taurus's eyes flashed with sacred power. Neither had to speak. They knew what had to be done. Lady Taurus rode low along the trail, her magenta skirt flowing behind her. From her bag, she pulled dynamite and placed it along canyon walls, dry washes, and rocky ridges. Marshal Will rode into the mountains, where the Holy Grail's hidden power guarded an old wagon and a special Gatling gun. He loaded it with golden bullets, hitched the horses, and blazed back down the trail. Lady Taurus waited in the shadows with her handy .38 and trusty double-barrel shotgun, watching the Wild Bunch whip the cattle closer. Then a flare shot into the sky. That was the signal. Lady Taurus smiled, closed her eyes, and thought of thunder. The canyon exploded. The whole ridge erupted with the biggest supernatural explosion the Arizona Territory had ever seen. Rainbow fire tore across the rocks. Golden sparks rained down. Purple lightning rolled through the dust. The ground shook so hard, the Wild Bunch dropped their whips and stumbled back in terror. The cattle ran free towards Strothers Creek, safe from harm. Then Marshal Will rolled in with the Gatling gun. Golden bullets flashed through the valley, cutting off every escape until every rustler threw up his hands and surrendered. Lady Taurus rode her beautiful white horse into the valley, while Marshal Will stepped forward, his golden gun glowing bright. The Wild Bunch finally understood. They had lost before they ever crossed W.B. Calhoun's property line. Marshal Will chuckled and said, "Don't you understand? Marshal Will and Lady Taurus entitle Love is in the Air as a romance has begun between the two characters. They quickly realized that they had a lot in common. Law enforcement being the peacemaker on WB, Calhoun's land being the sacred protectors of the Holy Grail. That's a lot of responsibility. One day, while they were having a picnic down by the waterfall at Strothers Creek, they heard a loud noise and a big boom, and smoke rose past the Twin Mountains. So they quickly settled up their horses and rode out to sea. What that noise was, and quickly they realized that W.B. Calhoun's property was being invaded by some big money ranchers, and some miners ready to come by W.B. Calhoun's mine for gold and treasures. Quickly, they jumped in the action. First, they observed what they were doing, where they were going, and exactly where their camp was at. Just as they started to get dark, it was time for them to make their move. They jumped down on these 22 men quicker than greased lightning. They had no idea what they were in for, as Marshal Will pulled out his golden gun and fired, and fired, and fired. To a group with a man fell down, as Lady Taurus pulled out her magical shotgun and let off 2 blasts that sound like 2 pieces of dynamite. As ever over, several men fell, as she reloaded and fired again into the mine. With the rest of the 20 men recited scared and confused, not knowing what was going on. She fired into the mine. The mine blew up, dropping the miners inside as they scream, "Help!" Things got silent. The wind blew with a mist of outlaws in the air as Marshal Will rounded up the men outside of the mine and tied them up to a tree. Lady Taurus started moving a rock away from the mine where the rest of the miners were trapped. He freed all the miners as they came out, dusty and dirty, coughing up the dust that were in the mine. At gunpoint, she landed them all up, and then she tied each one of them behind their back and made them lay face down on the ground. That's the tallest people showed up and disbelief of what had happened. They helped Marshal Will take all the outlaws and the miners back to Stewarttown's jail. And together, Marshal Will and Lady Taurus has protected W.B. Calhoun's lands and Strothers Creek, and the Holy Grail.
The dust over Stewarttown had barely settled after Marshal Will locked the Wild Bunch gang in jail, when a little bird brought worse news on the wind. The Over-the-Hill gang was riding in from Tombstone Territory. 40, maybe 50 old outlaws, all white men with long gray beards, big eyebrows, wild eyes, tilted hats, and brown horses thundering like a desert storm. They were headed straight for Stewarttown, promising to burn it down. Their first stop would be Frazier's Saloon. Marshal Will stood in the street, short, strong, and still. His yellow shirt snapped in the hot wind. His red bandana lifted at his neck. His finger twitched near his holster, and the pistol at his side began to shine gold. That was when Stewarttown knew the golden gun was waking up. Marshal Will gathered the townspeople, black faces and white faces, shoulder to shoulder. He told them what was coming, told them not to run, then gave them a plan. By sundown, the Over-the-Hill gang appeared between the Twin Mountains. They crossed Strothers Creek in a roaring stampede, shotguns strapped to saddles and .45s on hips. They rode into Stewarttown laughing, like it already belonged to them. Marshal Will stepped out before they reached Fraser Saloon. "There'll be no funny business in my town," he said. The gang laughed till their gray beards shook. "Move aside, little man," one outlaw sneered. "This is our town now." Marshal Will looked him dead in the eye. "When there's will," he said, "there's a way." The outlaws pushed past him and flooded into Fraser Saloon, ordering whiskey, food, rooms, and space for their horses. Marshal Will only smiled, because they were exactly where he wanted them. Then the east wind blew. Every candle in Fraser Saloon went dark, at once. The room fell silent. The outlaws stumbled, confused, grabbing tables and bumping into each other. Suddenly, Marshal Will raised the golden gun and fired into the air. A golden flash cracked through the darkness. Fireworks burst across the saloon, lighting every corner. Men fell to the sands or hell in cemeteries. Rifles clattered on floors.
At that signal, the townspeople rushed in from every door and window, surrounding the gang before they could draw. Marshal Will climbed onto a bar stool, golden gun glowing. "Over the hill, gang," he said. "You are under arrest. You're headed to Stewarttown Jail with no resistance, or else." The old outlaws looked around. Every escape was blocked. Every townsperson stood ready. At last the gang raised their hands. "You got us, Marshal Will," they said. "We give up." Marshal Will pointed toward the jail. "And don't you ever come back."